Your husband used to casually read the Bible before bed. Now he's saying, St. Maximus really resolves the tension between nature and hypostases. If you've ever known someone who converted to Calvinism, you might have heard the phrase cage phase. If you've met a freshly minted Calvinist, there's a good chance you've experienced it personally. Suddenly, your friend is explaining predestination during lunch, recommending a 12-part lecture series on Romans 9, quietly wondering whether you're elect because you disagreed with John Calvin one time in 2018. Obviously, I'm joking. Mostly. But honestly, Orthodoxy has a version of this too, because Orthodoxy has converts. Not usually as intense, not usually as argumentative, but definitely real. And before I go any further, I should probably say up front, it'll be hard for me not to laugh during parts of this episode, but only because I'm mostly laughing at myself. When someone discovers Orthodoxy, especially after years inside broadly evangelical or Reformed Christianity, it can feel like discovering an ancient world hidden underneath the modern one. And when that happens, people tend to get excited, very excited. Your husband used to go to a Bible study. Now he says things like, I think nominalism fundamentally altered Western sacramental theology. Or, I think the Reformation accidentally inherited more from late medieval Catholicism than people realize. And somehow, this is being said while buying groceries. Your husband used to casually read the Bible before bed. Now he's saying, St. Maximus really resolves the tension between nature and hypostases. And you're just trying to figure out what happened to the man who used to watch football highlights. Your husband used to ask, want to join our small group? Now he's explaining, the filioque actually affects anthropology if you follow it all the way down. And honestly, from the spouse's perspective, this probably feels like your husband got intellectually kidnapped by monks. Your husband used to listen to worship music in the car. Now he's voluntarily listening to a 3-hour lecture called Essence, Energies, and the Problem of Divine Simplicity. Your husband used to say, I just want a relationship with Jesus. Now he says, I think modern Christianity lost participation and replaced it with epistemic certainty. And technically, even if you understood every word of that individually, it's pretty hard to understand it collectively. Your husband used to care about fantasy football. Now he has strong opinions about the Council of Chalcedon. And honestly, if you're the spouse, there's a decent chance you're just sitting there wondering, I love you, but what is happening? I wanted to make this episode because I think converts often underestimate what this experience feels like from the other side, especially for spouses. Because for the convert, Orthodoxy often feels like a discovery. For the spouse, it can feel more like disorientation. The convert feels excitement, coherence, meaning, ancient continuity, like things finally make sense. But the spouse is often experiencing something very different. Suddenly, the vocabulary changes. Now there are words like theosis, hesychasm, liturgy, energies, Pascha, veneration, akathists. Your husband used to say quiet time. Now he says things like, I think modernity lost a participatory worldview. And you're standing there wondering when exactly this happened. But underneath the humor, I think something deeper is happening. Because conversion is rarely just changing churches. It's changing symbolic worlds. That's what makes it emotionally intense. For many broadly evangelical Christians, church is not just doctrine. It's family. It's music. It's rhythm. Relationships. Friendships. Shared assumptions. A spiritual language you've spoken your whole life. You know what closeness to God feels like in that environment. You know the rhythms. You know the emotional atmosphere. You know the culture. Then suddenly your spouse starts dragging you into a liturgy where nobody says anything for long stretches. Everyone is crossing themselves at different times. There's incense everywhere, and someone named Father Gregory is chanting in a tone that sounds like it came from another century. For a lot of people, walking into an Orthodox parish for the first time can feel a little like accidentally walking into a Mexican grocery store for the first time. Everything looks different. It smells different. Lots of things are in a language you don't natively speak. Everyone else seems to instinctively know what's happening. I remember going to a meat counter in a Mexican grocery store once, and apparently I was supposed to grab enough before getting in line. I had no idea. I just walked straight up to the counter and accidentally cut in front of everybody. Everybody was very gracious about it because they immediately realized this guy has no idea what's going on. And for a lot of people, that's kind of what walking into an Orthodox parish might feel like at first. You don't know the rhythms. You don't know what's important. You're trying not to embarrass yourself. You suddenly become aware of how culturally formed you are. And meanwhile, your husband is standing there acting like he finally found oxygen. That's a lot, especially because the convert is often moving very quickly internally. Hundreds of podcast hours, church history, theological frameworks, new prayers, new categories, new imagination. But the spouse often hasn't traveled that same internal distance yet. So now two people who love each other are suddenly inhabiting different spiritual atmospheres. And that asymmetry is hard. Not because one person is mature and the other is immature. Not because one loves God more, but because people rarely grow, process, and change at the exact same speed. And I should say here that my wife and I were actually in a somewhat different situation than many couples. Because my movement toward orthodoxy didn't happen suddenly. For years before I ever seriously considered orthodoxy, I was already openly struggling with major questions while we were in a conservative Presbyterian church. Those were probably some of the hardest years of my life spiritually. Not because I was offended by Reformed theology, not because I wanted liberal theology, not because I wanted Christianity to become easier. Actually, the opposite. I simply reached a point where I couldn't honestly defend certain things anymore. The Solas of the Reformation, certain assumptions about salvation, certain assumptions about grace, assumptions about the fall, what sovereignty really is, and human nature. And I wrestled with those questions painfully. I mean, really painfully. There's this strange experience where the framework you inherited slowly stops feeling stable internally. But you still want it to be true because it's the world you know. And for many people, when that process begins, it eventually leads toward liberal theology, deconstruction, or abandoning Christianity entirely. But for me, thank God, it eventually led me in the opposite direction, towards something older, more sacramental, more historical, more participatory. Honestly, something sturdier. But the important thing is that my wife saw all this happening in real time. She heard the doubts, the questions, the monologues, the frustrations, the corrections to my own thinking, the false accusations I initially made against orthodoxy before I understood it better, the fears, the confusion. She watched the process unfold slowly over a few years. So when orthodoxy finally entered the picture more concretely, it was still a huge transition for us, but it wasn't abrupt in the way it is for many marriages. She already knew I'd been wrestling deeply for a long time. I think that openness matters because when spiritual change happens silently and privately, spouses can suddenly feel blindsided, like the person they married secretly became someone else. And I don't think that's healthy. I think people need to let their spouse into that process. Even the uncertainty, even the confusion, even the unresolved questions. Because if your spouse only encounters the final form of your convictions after you've already mentally traveled 1,000 miles, the gap between where you are emotionally can seem enormous. And maybe that's part of what makes conversion difficult sometimes. One person feels like they've been on a long journey. The other feels like the ground suddenly moved underneath them overnight. And I think converts sometimes underestimate how much their spouse may feel like they're losing something. Not just a church, a world, friendships, familiarity, family expectations, a sense of spiritual confidence, and maybe most painfully, certainty. Once orthodoxy enters the conversation, terrifying questions sometimes follow. If orthodoxy is true, was I wrong about everything? Was my baptism real? Why do they practice closed communion? What happens to everything I've known spiritually? What about my parents, my pastor, the people who genuinely led me toward Christ? Those are not small questions. And I think this is why patience matters so much. Communion cannot be forced. You cannot drag another person into spiritual understanding at the speed of your excitement. And if everything I've been talking about in this series is true, participation, communion, personhood, freedom, then love itself has to leave room for asymmetry. Love has to leave room for another person to breathe. The irony is that converts often discover orthodoxy while searching for deeper communion with God, but sometimes accidentally create relational fragmentation at home because they're moving too aggressively, too anxiously, or too quickly. Not always, but sometimes. Because when something reorganizes your entire understanding of Christianity, it's hard to think about anything else. You suddenly feel like you discovered an ancient city buried underneath the modern world, and you want everyone you love to see it immediately. But human beings are not machines. communion takes time. One of the hardest spiritual disciplines might be learning to let another person move at their own pace without trying to manage their soul. That's difficult, especially when fear enters the picture. Fear that they won't understand. Fear that they'll reject it. Fear that you'll become spiritually divided. Fear that you'll make a mistake. Fear that your marriage is changing. Fear always tempts us toward control, but communion cannot survive control. And honestly, before I end this episode, some of us owe our spouses an apology, because this really is hard sometimes. It's hard when the person you married suddenly starts rethinking everything spiritually, when the rhythms change. It's hard when church stops feeling familiar. It's hard when family members don't understand. It's hard when friendships become complicated. It's hard when it feels like your entire spiritual world is shifting underneath you. From the side of the convert, part of what's happening is they're taking seriously responsibility. If I really believe something is true, if I really believe it's sturdier, if I really believe it can survive suffering, doubt, modernity, death, and the kinds of pressures that break people spiritually, then of course I'm going to care deeply about it. In some ways, it's almost like realizing your family needs to move somewhere difficult because your livelihood depends on it. Not because you want to uproot everyone, not because you enjoy destabilizing things, but because you genuinely believe you're trying to protect the people you love. And I think many converts feel that way spiritually. I'm trying to find something that can actually hold us together when life becomes unbearable. Something ancient enough, strong enough, deep enough, beautiful enough, true enough. Something that can take a real beating without breaking. And if you're the spouse of someone going through this, I really do hope you know the intensity often comes from caring, even when it's clumsy, even when it's overwhelming, even when it creates tension. And if you're the convert listening to this, be patient, be gentle. Do not let your search for communion with God destroy communion at home. And maybe sometimes the most Christ-like thing you can do is slow down enough to let the people you love breathe beside you while you walk through it together. The goal is communion. And I hope by God's grace we learn to love each other patiently enough to reach it together.